everyone, I'm Catherine Chien, Environment and Climate Lead at X. Today is Earth Day, and I'm thrilled to invite Dr. Suzanne Simard, Professor of Forest Ecology at the University of British Columbia, leader of the Mother Tree Project, and a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. Her research has demonstrated that complex symbiotic networks in our forests mimic our own neural and social networks. Additionally, her work has influenced filmmakers such as James Cameron for his Tree of Souls and Avatar. Her TED Talks have been viewed by more than 10 million people worldwide. In her upcoming book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, Suzanne writes how trees, living side by side for hundreds of years, have evolved, perceive one another, learn and adapt their behaviors, recognize neighbors, and remember the past. She also illustrates how they have agency about the future, elicit warnings and mount defenses, compete and cooperate with one another with sophistication, and possess other characteristics ascribed to human intelligence. For this talk, we'll take questions from the audience at the end and invite everyone to submit questions through the live YouTube chat. So Suzanne, a warm welcome.
Hello. Hi, thank you for having me.
Great. So the terms mother tree and mycorrhizal network are at the heart of your research. I thought we could start perhaps by you telling us what these terms mean and how they are central to your discoveries.
Yeah, so mycorrhizal networks are fungal, a certain kind of fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, which are symbiotic and mutualistic with plants, where they trade resources. So the plants and trees provide the fungus with carbon or photosynthate in exchange for nutrients and water that the fungus explores through the soil and brings back to the tree. And this has been known for quite some time, since the late 1800s, really. People understood that mycorrhizas were important in plant growth and survival and fitness. And actually, mycorrhizas were present when plants evolved and moved from ocean onto lands and were essential in the coevolution of plants and the fungi, and actually the oxygenation of our environment. And so researchers in the last few decades, starting in about 1980, started working on that these mycorrhizas can actually link plants together. So I wasn't the first person to discover that. That had been discovered and looked at in the United Kingdom about a decade before I started researching. And I found out about this work and started and asked the question of, whether or not these networks exist in nature, because that work had been done mostly in the lab, and none of it had been done in forests. So the other question was, does it include or does it occur in natural forests? And I found in my early research that yes, these networks do exist. And eventually then when I became an academic, I asked the question of what do the networks look like in the soil, in the forest itself? What does the map look like? And so I had a graduate student named Kevin Byler, and I worked with another prof named Dan Dural, and together we did this study where we looked at the DNA of all the fungi in the soil and put together this, basically a DNA map showing all the fungal networks that linked Douglas fir trees together in a Douglas fir forest. And what emerged out of that map was that there are these central trees, the biggest, oldest trees that are the hubs of the network. They're what link most of the other trees together. So they've got lots of roots, lots of fine roots, lots of points of contact. And so they're the most highly connected. And in our maps, we found that, almost 90% of the trees in one particular forest were linked to one particular tree. And so we did additional experiments to find out what these trees did, and it turns out that they actually are facilitate or help the regeneration of seedlings around them. And so because of the large size of these trees and the nurturing ability of them, we call them mother trees. So they're just the big hubs in that mycorrhizal network.
Great, fantastic. And I think when Nature first put your research and put it on a cover in 1997, they called your discovery a wood wide web. And also, I was hoping that you could elaborate on this and how this was prescient for your findings since then.
Yeah, I mean, it was very clever of Nature to call it was the cover issue of that or the cover photo of that particular issue for my article, and they called it the Wood Wide Web. And I thought that was so clever because the internet had actually just been discovered only a few years earlier. And it really didn't, I remember I started graduate school or my PhD in 1992, and that was the first time I ever used the internet, was when I started that. And so the World Wide Web was just invented. And then here I was finding, an internet below ground that was so similar that it was kind of patterned in the same way, with hubs and nodes, and then all these linkages that how people could connect through the internet, like could talk to each other, and even, communicate all across the world with certain central points and central players, sort of like thought leaders that actually could convey their messages more readily. And so really, that's a similar thing that we found out in forests. And so I don't think that nature really, because we hadn't mapped the network yet at that point, that still happened 20 years or 15 years later. But it was really prescient because it turned out that that map showed that what's under the forest floor, that this network is a neural network as well, and designed just as the internet is. They have the same kind of patterning. So yeah, it was very prescient, and it's been helpful, I think, in people understanding what the Wood Wide Web is and what it looks like and how useful it is.
Yeah, really interesting. And can you share a bit more about, you mentioned how these mother trees help the regeneration of seedlings around them. Can you talk a little bit more specific about those? Like, what do the mother trees get in return? I mean, is it just generosity of spirit or to perpetuate their own kind at the expense of maybe other species around them?
Yeah, so, old trees, or all mature trees, produce cones if they're healthy enough, and they disperse seed. And the seed, lots of studies have shown that most seed fall around that tree, right? Seed dispersal falls off exponentially as you go away from the tree. So we already knew for a long time that trees producing cones and dispersing their seeds, they're providing the seed and seedlings for the next generations. What the mother tree contributed to that story was that we found out that the network of these mother trees was sort of like the foundation. It was the place where these seedlings got started. So the old trees shed their seeds, the little seedlings germinated, and then they link into the network of the old trees right away, and then they can get subsidies of nutrients and carbon and water from those old trees. And we've been able to piece together experiment after experiment to show that and actually it actually enhances, or it's associated, this transmission of information and resources and connection to these old trees is associated with the regeneration of the forest. And so we were able to add on to that did these mother trees not just provide seed, but they also help the seeds succeed, germinate and succeed.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. I was kind of really struck by one of the examples in your book about how the then forest management techniques, the way they planted the seedlings, the roots just didn't take, versus in other areas, the roots did take and the seedlings were able to establish themselves properly. So that was really fascinating. I'm wondering, I guess at the time, this was a very novel concept, and I still feel like right now, the theme of cooperation versus competition in nature, and how humans manage nature, forestry, agriculture, gardening, and so on. The theme of cooperation is still maybe not as well understood today. Mm-hmm. So I was curious, like, how is this an essential question for your work? Is there cooperation across species, and why do species do that?
Yeah, so trees, they interact with each other, communicate with each other in numerous ways. They're sophisticated in how they interact. Just like we as human beings are very sophisticated in how we communicate. We speak, we have sign, we have body language, we have nuances. We can pick up on little small expressions, and so trees have got multiple ways of interacting and communicating with each other as well. So they compete, but at the same time they collaborate. And that's I think the great contribution of my first PhD work was that I was, very much focused on how, and so was the forest industry, on how weedy plants, which were considered weedy plants. Actually, they were early successional tree species like aspen and birch and cottonwood were viewed as weeds because they would sort of block the light getting down to the seedlings that they were trying to grow, these conifers that would provide the next, marketable wood products. And so they were managing this competition by getting rid of these deciduous trees. And I also saw that this was actually not helping the trees as much as they expected they did. Sometimes it was helpful to reduce that light competition, but other times actually the trees would get disease and they would weaken and die. And so I started looking at, that there are these other ways that these trees are actually interacting, that if we just focus on getting rid of them because they're competitors, that we're actually cutting off their ability to collaborate at the same time. And so what I found was that as these birch trees, for example, shaded Douglas fir, they actually sent more carbon below ground to Douglas fir, sort of balancing things out and enhancing the ability of the whole community to survive. So the Douglas firs could survive in the shade of the paper birch partly because they were getting these subsidies through the carbon exchange below ground. And so I think that work really opened up the idea that there's these multiple interactions going on. And it also, I have to harken back to the much earlier work than done by me by geneticists, coming way back to Darwin, even when he was formulating his theory of natural selection. It was based on competition and survival of the fittest, and competitive exclusion would lead to differentiation of species, and then that's why we have niches and we have species occupying different niches. And that's all a very valid theory, and it still holds up today. But one of the things that Darwin also wrote about was that collaboration is important in natural communities as well. And that part kind of got lost in translation of his work, or in the application maybe of his work. It's not that the theories of natural selection are wrong. It's just that this collaboration is important too. And later scientists, Lynn Margulis was always someone I admired, and she sort of came up with the endosymbiotic theory, showing that actually evolution of organisms actually involves coevolution most often. So even the evolution of human beings, we're a consortium of other organisms. Our DNA shows it, like the Human Genome Project showed that we actually have viral origins in our DNA, bacterial origins. And so we actually evolved from these very simple organisms that were co-evolved themselves. And so now that idea of coevolution is becoming, and cooperation is becoming more mainstream known, but in the application of practices like forestry practices or agriculture, we still very much focus on competition because that had such a strong, it was such a strong theory, and it just got taken to apply not just to evolution, but ecology and applied ecology as well, to the extreme, to where, now we really manage our forests to get rid of competition, get rid of the plants that we don't want. In agriculture, we do the same thing. We try to grow these simplified plantations that supposedly are supposed to just grow what we want. But in effect, we're actually hurting those companion species that help make the ecosystem work and be productive and diverse.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I love how the power of a question has motivated you each time to go to the next subsequent phase of your research. I'm curious, what are some of the most pressing questions that you're working on that's on your mind right now?
Yeah, well, I've done a lot. My career has been focused on basic and applied research, and they go hand in hand. They always have. I'm a very applied kind of person, but I've done a lot of basic research too. And what I want to do now, and what I am doing, is taking these findings on plant cooperation and communication in forests, and trying to apply it to how we manage our forests, our ecosystems, so that we don't cause them to decline. Because when we just look at it from this narrow perspective, and taking out the early successional plants, we're not seeing the whole picture. We need to see the whole picture and apply it. So I have a project called the Mother Tree Project that is taking up a lot of my focus, and that is how do we save these old trees in different ways, in different climates, and allow them to seed in the next generation of trees, while also migrating species and genotypes northward and into cooler climates, so that the plants can keep up with climate change? How do we do this? Like, it's a very complex question and very difficult because it's a dynamic and always fluid situation, because climate change is kind of unpredictable in many ways. So what is the way that we can, make or help our forests be resilient to reproduce, even as climate is making it more and more stressful? And we found some incredible stuff, right? We found that, old trees, these old mother trees, are helpful in migration of species, in protecting them as we migrate them physically ourselves. And also saving these old trees helps keep carbon stable, and the stocks high in the forest, and it also is correlated with higher biodiversity. So all these things fit together, and I really want to be able to examine this in my research, to publish it, and then help people see it and then apply it in real practices. And I think it's absolutely essential because our forests are getting clear-cut at a rapid rate. We're losing our old growth forests so rapidly to make forest products that we really have pushed our ecosystems to almost to the point of collapse in areas. And we really need good methodologies that are transformational, not the old clear-cut, burn and plant. That hasn't worked out so well, because we have a lot of problems in those forests, to more resilient forests. And I really believe we can do it. We just have to try these experiments, and get people to see what's possible, and then help them do it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so you touched on climate change, and you also touched on we're losing a lot of our forests. Mm-hmm. So maybe let's start with the second part first. Like, so what if we lose our forests? Like why do forests matter?
Oh my God. I, for one, wouldn't want to be in this world, I don't think, without forests. But so forests worldwide, they cover about a third of the land surface area. So they're, major part of our ecosystems. But they also house about 80% of our biodiversity worldwide. They store about 80% of the terrestrial carbon. They're the source of, in Canada, they're the source of almost all of our fresh water. And of course, through the process of photosynthesis and transpiration, they provide us with oxygen, the very life breath that we need in order to survive as a species ourselves. And so to me, a world without forests is a world without humans, because I don't think, and a lot of creatures, because we wouldn't actually survive without them. The world would go through a huge imbalance and try to self-regulate, but we might not be part of that new system.
Right, yeah. So it sounds like, yes, forests are super important for us. The second thing is doesn't sound like we're managing them well enough. I mean, the importance of mother trees. You're working on helping to get the word out on how to better manage this. Mm-hmm. But we also have the threat of climate change. Mm-hmm. How is climate change affecting the forest today?
Well, so climate change is putting our forests under a lot of stress. So as temperatures rise, forests have not, the trees themselves, because climate change has been so rapid, they have not co-evolved to change as rapidly as climate is changing. The velocity of change is way faster than, the adaptation of trees in the past. And so climate change is stressing them out at a genetic level, and it's being also expressed in how they're being disturbed. So fire, insect disturbance, pathogens are natural parts of forest ecosystems. Disturbance is a natural, essential, regenerative part of forests. But if it's too extensive, then the forests don't have, and too rapid, they can't keep up with that. And so that's where forests need our help in trying to slow down the rate of climate change, and then helping the forests to adapt by moving plants around. I mean, that's one of the things we need to do. The other thing that's so important that I want to make a point about is that, we can plant trees, and we have plans to plant a lot of trees to help mitigate climate change effects, because to mitigate the positive feedback loops of deforestation back to the atmosphere, planting trees can help take up more CO2. However, that is not as good of it's only part of the solution. The other and more important part of the solution is we need to stop cutting down our old growth forests, because the ones that are left have the biodiversity. They store a ton of carbon. They are already doing it. We don't need to start over again and start from scratch, because when we cut down those old growth forests, we actually lose a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. We lose species. So let's keep what little left that we have to provide a legacy for moving forward, and then focus our planting efforts on places that have already been deforested, or that are second growth forests. So those are two things, right, in forestry that we need to do. We need to reduce the rate of cut of old forests, or stop cutting old forests and focus on second growth forests. We need to help plants migrate so that they can continue to survive and adapt in these new changing climates. And on top of that, the other overriding elephant in the room, that none of this stuff will succeed if we don't decarbonize our energy sector, right? We need to reduce fossil fuel consumption, or this won't work either. They got to go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Super, very important. I guess on the climate change point, before we move on to the forestry management point. Yes, like fires, pests, disease are natural parts of the forest life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, could you maybe elaborate a bit more, or give more examples? How specifically does climate change affect these three things? If they're already things that happen naturally, why would we attribute that to an anthropogenic effect?
Right. So over the millennia, disturbances on Earth have always been happening, and within a fairly, climate has gone up and down, of course, over the millennia. We're just in this period now where temperature increases and CO2 concentrations are on this exponential
Mm-hmm.
growth rate. And so the result of that is that these disturbance regimes that have basically resulted from evolution and adaptation over millennia are changing really, really rapidly. And so things like fire, let's take fire, for example. Fire is a normal disturbance agent on our landscapes. Most of the forests around the world rely to some extent or another on fire as a regenerative disturbance. And if we didn't ever have fire, these forests would suffer. They needed to reproduce and renew themselves. But climate change, the increases in temperature and the shifting in precipitation patterns and also management practices that have excluded fire from ecosystems for the last 50 years or more, have changed those fire regimes so that they're more extensive, they're more severe, they're more frequent now. And though the trees are not adapted to that either, right? So the message here is that we need to change certain practices, like allowing burns or controlled burns to renew our ecosystems before that, nature just burns the stuff down. And also let natural disturbances run their course to a certain extent, as long as they're not, creating more devastation than that would allow the system to recover. So we need to sort of try to return to natural disturbance regimes within the limits that humanity has now placed on that. It's essential. And it's the same thing with insects and pathogens. So those are both biological disturbance agents, unlike fire, which is abiotic. It's, from lightning
Mm-hmm.
and people starting fires. But these other biological disturbance agents, like insects, they're affected by climate change as well. So as temperatures go up, their reproductive cycle actually speeds up. And so we get more insects. And as trees become stressed out, they're more vulnerable to insect infestations. And so the effect is that it's more severe.
Mm-hmm.
And so keeping in mind that pathogens and insects, they love weak individuals because they can be the final mortality agent.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to make sure, or we need to really try to keep our forests vigorous and healthy and resilient. And that's comes back to the Mother Tree Project of how do you do that? Well, leaving some old trees to nurture the new generation of seedlings coming along so they're healthy and strong is all important for them to be resilient and resistant to these different disturbance agents.
Right, yeah. And so how do you define like what are good mother trees to keep, and how do you measure the characteristics of, are we doing a better job at protecting them? I guess quality and quantity, I suppose.
Yeah, so in the first question, we asked, what is a mother tree? And so the qualities of a mother tree, they're just the biggest trees in the forest. And we found also the oldest trees because we conducted that primary research in uneven age forests. But even a forest that's got one age, that we call those even age forests, there's a size differentiation in those forests too. So the biggest trees in that case would be the mother trees. And the reason that we look for the biggest trees is because they have more extensive root systems. They support usually a more diverse array of fungal species that have their different niches that can acquire resources from the soil. And so that becomes like a positive feedback. A bigger network means a bigger mother tree, but also a greater ability to nurture the next generations of seedlings. So when you're looking for them, they're the big trees in the forest. We all know which ones. When you walk in the forest, you can see they've got big diameter and they're tall. Right. They have other characteristics too. They've usually got big branches and they have lichens on them. In my neck of the woods, they have lichens on them and different fungi. They are magnets of biodiversity themselves.
Yeah, fascinating. I love to see one myself. Yeah, so I was also here, I guess, moving on. One question is, how do we, I was remarked to understand that, to find out that a third of British Columbia's forested area, is lost to the pine bark beetle. We're seeing the same thing in California, obviously. In Canada, as you wrote, most years, more carbon is lost to wildfire than burning of fossil fuels. And I guess right now, there is a lot of regeneration and planting that need to happen. I was heartened to hear that, Canadian policymakers have revised their regeneration policy to halve the amount of herbicide use. They've relaxed the weeding policy to tolerate a few aspens and birches, what was previously thought as weeds. I'm curious, what else can we do to help make the progress go faster, with a scientific understanding, technology, business?
Yeah, there's so many things that can be done, big things and small things. From the technology side, we want to be able to save these trees or help protect them. And, they're vulnerable. If you just leave one old tree, it's vulnerable to falling over in the wind or just from drought or shock from being, stripped of the neighbors. And so a technology that can be developed is, how do you extract wood in a very craftsman kind of way? So still harvesting the forest, but leaving those mother trees so that they are protected. And, the big machines that we have out there now, we could actually have smaller machines that go in and, or hand fallers, that creates more jobs, and learn and teach and train people how to select these trees and then protect them with their neighbors. So that's one thing. Just the machinery and the technology of logging can be improved. The other things technology-wise is, the work that I do, these long-term projects, the Mother Tree Project is a 100-year project. The amount of, and it's huge, right? It covers an area almost the size of Sweden. It's like a 900-kilometer long gradient. And it involves 24 forests. And so the labor that we put into this to count carbon, to count biodiversity is huge. And it's great because students can train doing this, but we can do some technology that would improve things, right? So we can have sensors that someone like Microsoft could develop that can help us actually measure carbon in real time and how it's changing, rather than us going to have to dig holes, take it to the lab, burn it to find out the carbon content and so on. There is lots of technologies that can be developed, and even probably some of it still exists out there, but just to mechanize some of that data collection. And it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be out there learning, but we would be able to collect more data, right? We'd be able to say, well, the carbon in the soil and above ground is changing in this way, and it's correlated with moisture in the soil, and it's correlated with, you know, the soil food web, changes in the soil food web. If we could do that, we would be able to answer questions so much more quickly. I mean, I don't have the resources to do that, right? I'm always doing my research on feels like a shoestring. I'm always like struggling to get enough money to pay that I don't actually get that technology going myself, but other companies can do that. We need them to do that. We need them to step in and actually develop that technologies. You know, drones are another example. We can actually map out, you know, at a very fine scale, so, you know, what's happening above ground and below ground with drone work, really excellent drones. And then the models and technologies to analyze that data need to be developed at a, you know, small scales and big scales. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. And then, so you asked about business, and you asked and technology. Yeah. So on the business side, you know, governments right now, at least in Canada, rely on selling of wood products for 2x4s. And that's what drives harvesting, so that we can create jobs and we can get gross domestic product for our economy. But there's other ways to value forests that we haven't done. So I mentioned, you know, that they're homes to biodiversity. They provide our clean air and our clean water. They regulate climate. These are like existential needs, right? We need these things from forests. And yet we're cutting them down for these other simple economic gains because we're not valuing the forest for its life providing services. So governments need to make that step. They need to make the step to value the forest for those other goods and services. One of the good umbrella ones is carbon itself, right? Carbon is easy to measure, and it's, well, I just said how hard it is to measure, but it's actually not that hard, right? It just takes labor and technology, but we can do it. And so we can value carbon because we can measure it. And so that if we can put a price on carbon, and then also, you know, invest in saving forests, these old growth forests, instead of cutting them down for 2x4s, invest in them to save them. That's called using carbon offsets, which these large companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon could do, right? They can invest in carbon offsets to save these old growth forests for all of the values that they produce, while, you know, they can then offset their own carbon footprints. I mean, it's not a perfect solution, but these are business tools that can be put in place to really move the dial forward in helping save forests to help us mitigate climate change.
Yeah, and hopefully one day we can differentiate the quality and the pricing of a carbon offset by how much they protect mother trees.
Yes, I think that will happen. We just need to keep working on it.
Yeah. So I believe we do have a few audience questions coming in, and folks should continue to feel free to drop more questions in the live YouTube chat. But before we turn to the audience, I had a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
You know, yeah, the first one is, you know, I guess, what made you decide to publish this book at this particular point in time? You know, you're very established in your career. You're well recognized for the work that you're doing on plant intelligence and forest intelligence. So curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I'm 60 years old. I've been doing this, working in forests my entire life. I grew up in them and I've worked in them, and I feel like I've got a body of research that shows a path forward for these problems that we've just talked about, how to create resilient forests. It's my whole life's work, and I have a contribution to make that can help the world deal with this wicked problem of climate change. And so I wanted to get the word out, and I recognize, you know, I did that initial work, for example, on connection between plants, Douglas fir and paper birch, and carbon transfer 30 years ago. And that journal article, while it was recognized at the time because it was published in Nature, it didn't really change anything, right? It was like, oh, it was a cute study and interesting, but it didn't actually change forest practices. And so I think it's because people just it wasn't widely known enough, and the research was new, and now I've developed more and more of it. The story is filled out. There's still lots of gaps for sure, but I feel like we know enough now that we can make these changes, and we need to make these changes. And so I wanted the public to understand that. And I wanted them to also, in order for the public to pressure governments and corporations to do to take the responsibility of doing that, that people need to relate to it. And there's so many relatable things about forest to human societies that I was discovering. And I thought this is so important that people know this so that they can, feel in their hearts to do something and connect and realize that these trees, these forests are our ancestors, that there are our caregivers, that they are keeping our lives here, and we owe a responsibility to look after them. And so I wanted my book to really reach out to the public to do that. I'll just quickly also say that, other people were starting to write about my work in other books, and I wanted to get the full context of the story out, that the work that I did grew out of from where I came, from British Columbia, that I was a child of the forest. I did all my research in these forests. I know them really well. And that not all research is like that. And when people write about it, I want, they don't always get that context. And I wanted people to know that science is a human endeavor. It comes from a place in our hearts. We work at it extremely hard. It takes decades, especially in forests, and huge amounts of effort. And I just wanted people to understand that part of it, that, that it's important to know where it came from. And it gives people confidence and trust, I think, in the science better.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, forest management is a 100-year cycle, as you've written about as well.
At least it should be at least, right?
At least 100 years, versus our own human lifespans, even though it's getting longer. But I think also we tend to be quite short-term as a society too. So it's like, how do you reconcile that short-termism versus the long-term horizon needed for climate, for forestry, and nature?
That's such a great question. I mean, I think that the economists, right? I mean, our economy is built on these short quarterly profit margins. And this is part of our problem, is that forests are long-lived creatures. Our oldest trees are 5,000 years old, which is, well beyond the time frame of a quarterly report in a financial statement. And so we need to be able to value things over their long-term qualities better. But I think that there are ways to do that by, if we value, say, put a price on carbon, and we know that the most carbon comes from these old forests in these humid environments, then suddenly it becomes relatable in our economic model. It's just the economics need to be either they need to change to recognize these externalities of environment, or they need to embrace different aspects of the environment that are going to be valued, help it value it properly, like carbon, for example, or water,
Right. So before we turn to the questions in a minute, I'm intrigued by the Mother Tree project. It's a 100-year project, you were saying, and a huge swath of the forest in Canada. Could you tell us a bit more about that? What are your aspirations? How can we help?
Yeah. So I started this project about 6 years ago. I was in my mid-50s, and so starting a 100-year project when you're 55 is kind of weird. But all forestry projects are like that, right? Trees are long-lived creatures. So I started this project. The other thing about trees and forests is that they're big, right? They live to great ages, and they're big. And so these experiments are expansive. They cover huge areas. But I wanted to have something real, right? A real project that was the size of a forest, because, if you do your work all in labs or in a greenhouse, or even on little plots of land, which is historically what we've done, we miss the picture of the whole forest, and we go astray. We don't get the whole machinations of how the forest works. So I wanted it to be realistic and long-term, because trees live, like we said, to 100 or 5,000 years old. So it needed to be realistic. And I wanted to get lots of students involved, and so that, because it's their future, right? And the students have embraced it. They've taken it, and they're doing the work. They're publishing their own papers from it. And that is my dream, is to have this legacy that people can come back to and do these long-term important experiments to help us figure out how to proceed as climate changes and really stresses our system so much. There are solutions out there, and I wanted to be part of that.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah, really exciting work.
Thank you.
All right, so maybe we can start taking questions from the audience. All right, so the first question, is the World Wide Web global in the way the internet is? Or is it many forest networks around the world that are disconnected from each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is global. So all tree species around the world are dependent on mycorrhizas. So for their fitness, that means that to survive, they need to be associated with these fungi. It's the fungi can't exist without their trees or plants for carbon. So all over the world, trees form mycorrhizas, and because a lot of these mycorrhizas are what we call generalists, meaning that they can associate with many hosts, and they do that because it provides them with insurance that if one of their hosts dies, at least they've got a carbon source. And so because of the generality of so many fungi worldwide, these networks have the potential to exist in all forests worldwide. And they do. People study them all over the world. I specialize in the West Coast of North American forests, but I've watched other labs around the world are investigating as well networks in different kinds of ecosystems, including forest ecosystems elsewhere. So yeah, they do exist worldwide, just like the global internet does. And as far as disturbed ecosystems go, these networks can reform themselves, right? Even if you convert like a forest to an agricultural field, the network or the players in the network, the fungi will change, the plants change, but those networks still exist, and they do reform and reorganize themselves, but just with different players, different species.
Interesting. Okay. Next question. Do we know what happens when a mother tree is cut down or dies, but the rest of the forest remains intact? Do we know if changes occur in the next oldest, most connected tree?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So the forests are dynamic naturally. There's always death and mortality and natality going on, death and birth. It's a constant. And there's different patterns, like some forests will completely burn down and start over again. A tree will die and then other seedlings will come into the gaps. It's all natural part of the cycle. That latter thing where trees die in small gaps, like maybe the elder of that old forest dies from natural causes and light comes in and the little seedlings and saplings that have been growing around her or the tree will rise up and become, fill in that gap. And eventually they grow up and to become the tallest tree in the forest, and they become a mother tree themselves. And so it is a very dynamic situation all the time in forests, and any tree has the potential to become a mother tree. That said, there is a lot of variability in forests, and that variability arises from the genetics of the individuals, where the seed happened to land. Is it a good spot? Is there lots of water and nutrients? Did it get a little head start? Was the seed bigger? And so there's this natural we call it stratification in forests. So some trees will always be hanging out in the understory, and they might never make it to that big prominent position in the canopy. But it doesn't mean they're not important. Like, it doesn't mean just because they're not the biggest, oldest tree doesn't mean they're not an important part of the network. They are, in that they link the other trees together through hops and skips and jumps. They have their roles as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Right. Let's continue. So I've visited both the mother and father tree of the forest at Big Basin. What's the difference between the two, and which came first?
I don't know what the mother and father tree of the Big Basin is, because I've never been to the Big Basin. I guess that's in California. Yes. The Great Basin, I guess. It's the Great Basin is what you're thinking of. So I'll just continue
Redwoods,
on.
Yeah.
The Redwoods? Is it the Redwoods? Yeah. Is that what she's thinking of?
I believe so. There's a Big Basin Redwoods State Park. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so some tree species have both males and females in the same tree, and most of our coniferous trees are like that. And some there's a mother tree and a father tree. So one's got pollen producing cones and the other has a seed producing cone. Most of our trees, though, are of where both are in the same tree. And so they're all important. And the mothers and the fathers, or the one where they're both the same sex in the same tree, is important. They're all important. It's the big old one, the size and the age that's the important part. And the reason we call them mother trees is because of it resonates with people. They understand that, and that part about how they nurture their seedlings through the networks and the interaction between them. Led us to call them mother trees so that people could relate to it more. But all of these trees are important. And, you know, so it's really just focusing on the size and the age of the trees that you should think about.
Got it. Yeah. And I think I was also struck by a point you made in a book, which is when the mother trees die, like how they just kind of, maybe it's better for you to talk about it. What happens when they die?
Right. That was the other part of the question. Yeah. So, so, you know, our forests are under stress. Death and mortality happens all the time in forests. Naturally, even without climate change, it happens. And when trees die, it's a process. Dying is a process. You know, the trees will become weakened. They might be, you know, maybe just because of old age, or maybe because it was an unusually droughty period. And so when they become weakened and stressed, then other agents will come in, like insects and pathogens. And eventually, if the tree becomes weakened enough, the tree will die. In that process of dying, there are many things going on. One of them is that, you know, the roots will turn over in the soil. They'll start to die back. The mycorrhizas change. They might change the age of the kind of species there, change as the tree ages. And what we have found is that as a tree dies, that it actually starts sending carbon into the network itself right before it passes on, or in the years before, as it's going away, as it's dying. And that carbon can be directed through the mycorrhizal network to certain neighbors. So we found that more goes to kin, for example, their kin seedlings. More goes to to seedlings that are much smaller, and then then it becomes a directed exchange of carbon that those trees will. It has instead of the carbon dispersing just randomly to the atmosphere, it actually goes right into the other trees. So this was an important finding, and I, you know, I have to say that, you know, that initial work, like working with these big old trees and measuring this stuff is really hard to do. You know, to label a big tree with lots of carbon isotope, to trace it is almost impossible. And so we've worked with smaller trees to make these discoveries so that we can actually work with the tools that we had available to us in order to make that discovery. But yeah, so we found about 40% of the carbon within a few days of dying, it will disperse to its neighbors through its mycorrhizal network.
Okay. Yeah. The last inheritance for this next
generation.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Next question is, do you see a role for nature connection and eco-psychology in the Mother Tree Project? This is my focus, and I'll love to connect the dots.
Yes, absolutely. You know, one of my motivations for the Mother Tree Project is to provide people a space to go and see, or even to know that space exists, that they can see it even on a movie if they want to. But yeah, to get people to connect with nature is not only good for the forest, because then we care for the forest more. We exercise our responsibility towards the forest more responsibly, but it's also good for our health, right? So you know, most people who have, whether it's been in a forest or a savanna or a grassland or any kind of natural ecosystem, or even a park or walking down a boulevard, I know for myself, I feel a lot better. You know, I feel calmer, I feel more rejuvenated, I feel refreshed, my mind calms down. And people have studied this, you know, they call it forest bathing in some places, but it's really just being in the forest and relaxing with those things that are our natural relations. It's really good for our psychology. So yeah, it's good for our spirits, it's good for our physical well-being as well. I'll just say one other thing. There's actually chemicals that are in the soil that bacteria and fungi produce that actually make us feel better too. It is our sense of being relaxed, but there's also these sort of chemicals, like almost like you know, aphrodisiacs, almost that we smell, and we feel this rejuvenation when we're in the forest. And it's actually these chemicals that are being produced by these soil organisms. And when it rains, they produce even more. And so that feeling, that smell that you smell when you go in a forest right after it rains, that's actually those bacteria that are, you know, kind of breaking apart as the rain is coming down, and they're reacting to it. So
wow, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think during this pandemic as well, a lot of people have return to benefit from nature.
For sure. It's just, you know, you can just walk out your door and you can feel normal again and better.
Right. Okay, I think we have a couple of questions left. Let's see what time. So how did you figure out that academia was the path for you? And do you have recommendations for students interested in sustainability, but unclear if they want to go back to academia versus industry or NGO?
Yeah, you know, I didn't start out thinking I wanted to go into academia. I actually just wanted to be a forester. And, you know, and I just followed my path and opportunities. And I had always had this curiosity, and it turned out it was a good place for me and a good home for me. But I've been in all of the different sectors. I haven't been in an NGO, but I have worked in industry and so on. They all have lots to offer, and all, you know, you can find your place in any one of those. You know, it's really about you and the good work that you want to do. It doesn't have to be academia. Academia is a kind of a tough place to be, but it also is extremely rewarding. And I have to say, if I look back on my career, of all the places I worked, industry, government, consulting, that it was in academia that I really was able to make my biggest contributions. It was the place for me that I could follow my curiosity the best, even though it was also the most challenging place to work as well. I would encourage you, if you have if you want to, you know, if you have it, if you want to do it, persevere and go do it. You can do it.
It's good advice. Okay. Do all tree species participate in the network equally, or do some species participate more than others?
That's a really great question. So, you know, there's different kinds of, or different groups of fungi, of mycorrhizal fungi. There's about 5 or 6 groups, and usually as a species, you associate with one group or another. We have ectomycorrhizas, arbuscular, ericoid, and so on. And so usually, you know, you're in your group and you don't associate with those other trees in that way anyway, through the network, that don't associate with your group. And so within a certain group, like the firs and pines and in my forest, and spruces, they form a network. And it's not the same network. They're not in the same membership network as a cedar, a yew, and a maple tree, because they form arbuscular networks. And so they're not, you know, they are separate, even though they would be interacting in other ways beyond their mycorrhizas alone, because that's just one aspect of linkage and communication in forests. So they're not all equal in that they have specific entry points into these networks, or they have specific associations with specific networks. It doesn't mean that the network isn't important to them all, or they might not be important to the network. It's just that they have different roles, and maybe saying equal isn't the right word. It's just different. They can be very separate in their own separate networks and not interacting as much with certain neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Right. I had a question on that. So arbuscular mycorrhiza, I guess currently with the die-off and you know, we're losing the forest, could there be an opportunity, or would it make sense if the ectomycorrhizal dependent species aren't able to regenerate as quickly to shift to arbuscular mycorrhiza? Or are those environments kind of too harsh for them to exist in the first place without cooperating with others?
That's a really interesting question. I've never thought of that question before. So we know that trees and plants co-evolved with their fungi, right? So, and that has happened over millions of years, and you know, and with their environment. So in the tropical forests, the tropical trees are generally associated with arbuscular mycorrhizas, and there are a few ectomycorrhizal tree species. As you get into temperate forests, it's kind of a mix, but mostly ectomycorrhizal. And then as you go even further north into the boreal forest, it's exclusively ectomycorrhizal. And then they also associate, or there's a lot of plants that are ericoid mycorrhizal. And so you can't really just take a tree, like say a tropical tree species, and say, oh, I'm going to move it into an ectomycorrhizal community, and because it's from a southern latitude, and hope that it's going to do well. It's not going to do well. It's going to have the wrong fungal associates, because those fungal associates are locally evolved with their local tree species. And And what would have to happen in order for that to to shift from a say a temperate forest that's predominantly ectomycorrhizal to the one that's predominantly arbuscular mycorrhizal, you'd have to shift the tree species composition, and then the fungi will have to come along with them in order to do that. But it's not really a good idea, right? I think it's as we deal with and help with climate change, we've got to be gradual and helpful when it makes sense to keep the pairings that have evolved, because that is the most beautiful and elegant and best performing partnership that you could ever hope to work with, right? You can't really create that in a lab yourself very well and hope that it's going to change the world.
Right. Yeah. The tapestry has to all fit together.
It does. Yes. Good way to summarize that.
We have a couple more minutes left. One quick question, and one thing we're seeing, from the agricultural space is a big movement on soil carbon. I guess the question is how to measure it properly, and because it's such a huge carbon sink, and our measurement methods are what they are today, and yes, there'll be improvements over time as with technology as we put effort on it to actually start measuring it. But the error bars are pretty big today. So how do you see that shifting going forward in terms of the measurement precision? Because if we're to build financial instruments like offsets around it, there needs to be some
accurate measurements of soil carbon. Yeah, no, that's a really, really great question. So there's different ways you can measure soil carbon. The easiest way, and the way that I use it, the cheapest way is to actually dig. You actually go into the soil and you get samples, and you measure the bulk density and the carbon concentration, and you basically do a mass balance. And in the early days of agriculture, when we measured carbon content in soil, we focused in the top 20 centimeters of soil because that's where corn roots grow, and we ignored the deep soil layers. Now, so that moving forward, we need to get the full balance all the way down to a meter or more if we can, because there is actually more carbon stored at deeper levels than we ever knew. So that's one advance that needs to be made. Even if you do this very basic of digging the soil, getting the sample, but measuring bulk density, and then adding it all up. That's one method. And it works, right? It's actually pretty accurate, I think. And the more, to get the error bars down, you just need more samples, right? You can increase your sampling. So lots of people doing it, and getting the technology for getting those samples can be improved because it's hard to do. The other way that can be done is using, and the there's this global network called FlexNet, and FlexNet is where we put up these big towers. They can be like 100 meters tall, and there are hundreds of them around the world now in different kinds of ecosystems. These towers that have sensors on them that measure gas exchange, so they can measure CO2 coming out of the soil and the ecosystem they're in. All of the greenhouse gases they'll measure those exchanges. And that's a really good way to do it. It's highly technological. It doesn't really get at the microsite scale that it can be very variable, but it can, at the forest scale, it's actually it works quite well. Yeah, so there are ways. Yeah, there are different ways to do it.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, for your time today. It was I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for making the time, and thanks to the audience for the questions. So I hope everyone can look out for Suzanne's book. It's coming out on May 4th, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. And also to learn more about the Mother Tree Project, to go to mothertreeproject.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.